Story 1. The Midnight Visitor. Mary had always known that something was different about their neighborhood, but she couldn't put her finger on what it was. It was a typical suburban area, rows of neat little houses, each with its own manicured lawn and white picket fence. The streets were usually quiet, especially at night, with only the occasional car passing by. But there was something in the air, a sense of unease that Mary couldn't quite shake. It was a cold, windy night when the strange events began. Mary was lying in bed, staring at the ceiling, trying to will herself to sleep. The wind outside howled through the trees, causing their branches to scrape against the side of the house, casting long, eerie shadows on the walls. It was late past midnight, and the rest of the house was silent. Her little brother, Tommy, was asleep in the room next to hers, and their mother had gone to bed hours ago. Mary's father was away on one of his frequent business trips. He was often gone for weeks at a time, leaving Mary, Tommy, and their mother to fend for themselves. They were used to it by now, but it never got any easier. Mary missed the sense of security her father brought with him when he was home. Without him, the house felt too big, too empty. Just as she was about to drift off to sleep, Mary heard a soft, almost imperceptible knock at the front door. At first, she thought she had imagined it. She lay still, holding her breath, listening intently. But then she heard it again, a little louder this time. Her heart began to race. Who could be knocking at their door at this hour? She slipped out of bed and crept down the hallway, her bare feet silent on the cold wooden floor. The house was dark, the only light coming from the faint glow of the street lamp outside, which filtered through the curtains. As she neared the front door, she saw her mother standing in the hallway, her face pale and tense. "Stay in your room, Mary," her mother whispered when she saw her, but Mary couldn't move. She was rooted to the spot, her eyes wide with fear and curiosity. She watched as her mother walked to the closet and pulled out her father's old shotgun. Mary had never seen her mother look so scared. The sight of the gun in her mother's hands sent a chill down her spine. Her mother approached the door cautiously, the shotgun held tightly in her trembling hands. "Who's there?" she called out, her voice shaking. There was no answer, just more knocking, soft but insistent. Mary's mother hesitated, then slowly reached for the doorknob. She looked through the peephole but saw nothing. After a moment of indecision, she opened the door just a crack. There was no one there. Mary's mother quickly shut the door and locked it, her hands trembling. "Go back to bed, Mary," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. But Mary knew her mother was scared too. She could see it in the way her mother's hands shook as she clutched the shotgun. Mary returned to her room, but sleep was impossible. She lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, listening to every sound. The wind outside continued to howl, and every creak of the house made her jump. She felt like something was watching her, something just beyond the edge of her vision. The next morning, Mary's mother was up early, looking haggard and tired. She had hardly slept at all. When they went outside, they found something strange near the front of the house. In the soft dirt just outside the door, there were footprints. They were large, like a man's, but there was something odd about them, as if whoever had made them was dragging something heavy. The prints led away from the house, disappearing into the distance. But that wasn't all they found. Caught in the bushes near their front yard was a length of barbed wire. It was rusty and sharp, and it made Mary shiver just to look at it. Her mother's face grew even paler when she saw it. Without a word, she went back inside and called the police. The police arrived a short time later, a pair of officers who looked just as unnerved as Mary felt. They examined the footprints and the barbed wire, taking pictures and asking questions. Mary's mother explained what had happened the night before, her voice low and strained. The officers exchanged glances, their expressions grim. "Keep your doors and windows locked," one of the officers advised. "And if anything else happens, call us immediately." Mary's mother nodded, but Mary could see the fear in her eyes. As the officers drove away, she hugged Tommy tightly, trying to reassure him. But Mary knew that her mother was just as scared as she was. The rest of the day passed in a blur of tension and unease. Mary couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. Every time she glanced out the window, she half expected to see someone standing there, just beyond the fence, staring back at her. But there was never anyone there, just the empty street and the swaying trees. That night, Mary and Tommy slept in their mother's room. It was cramped and uncomfortable, but none of them wanted to be alone. The wind had died down, leaving an eerie silence in its wake. Every sound seemed magnified: the creak of the floorboards, the distant hum of the refrigerator, the soft rustling of the trees outside. Mary lay awake, staring at the ceiling, her heart pounding in her chest. She listened to the steady breathing of her mother and brother, trying to calm herself. But then she heard it again, a soft noise, almost too quiet to notice. It was coming from outside near the back of the house. She sat up, straining to hear. It sounded like someone walking, their footsteps muffled by the grass. She held her breath, her heart racing. The sound grew louder, closer. She could hear the crunch of gravel underfoot. Mary's mother stirred, sitting up in bed. She had heard it too. Without a word, she reached for the shotgun, her face set in grim determination. She motioned for Mary to stay put, but Mary couldn't just sit there. She had to know what was happening. Together, they crept out of the bedroom and down the hallway. The house was dark, the only light coming from the faint glow of the moon through the windows. They reached the back door, and Mary's mother paused, listening. The footsteps had stopped. She slowly unlocked the door and opened it, the shotgun held at the ready. The cool night air rushed in, carrying with it the scent of damp earth and pine needles. They stepped outside, scanning the yard. But there was no one there, just the empty darkness stretching out before them. Suddenly, a loud crash echoed through the night. Mary jumped, her heart leaping into her throat. The sound had come from the side of the house. Her mother quickly turned, the shotgun raised, but the darkness swallowed everything beyond the reach of the moonlight. They hurried to the side of the house, where the noise had come from. The ground was littered with broken glass. One of the windows had been shattered. Mary's mother scanned the area, but there was no sign of anyone. The night was still, almost oppressively so, as if the world was holding its breath. "Get inside," her mother whispered urgently. Now. They retreated back into the house, locking the door behind them. Mary's mother called the police again, her voice shaking. They arrived within minutes, but there was no trace of the intruder. They searched the yard and the surrounding area, but found nothing. Whoever had been there was gone. "This isn't safe," Mary's mother said after the police had left. "We're leaving." They packed their bags quickly, not even bothering to turn off the lights. Mary could see the fear in her mother's eyes, the way her hands shook as she gathered their things. Tommy clung to her side, his small hand clutching hers tightly. They left the house in the dead of night, driving to Mary's aunt and uncle's place across town. For the next few days, they stayed with their relatives, trying to put the events behind them. But Mary couldn't forget. Every night, she lay awake, listening to every sound, every creak of the house. She couldn't shake the feeling that they were still being watched, that something was out there, waiting. When Mary's father finally returned home, he was furious. He spoke with the police, demanding answers. That's when they found out about Mr. David. Mr. David was an old man who lived a few houses down from Mary's family. He had always been a bit strange, but no one had ever thought much of it. But in recent weeks, he had been acting even more oddly, wandering around at night, carrying something heavy. The police had questioned him, but he had denied everything. Still, they found evidence that he had been sneaking around Mary's house, watching them, leaving the footprints and the barbed wire. The police took him in for further questioning, but Mary's family never found out what happened to him. They didn't want to know. They moved to a new neighborhood far away, leaving the old house and the memories behind. But even in their new home, Mary couldn't escape the memories of that night. The soft knock on the door, the shattered window, the footprints in the dirt, they haunted her, creeping into her thoughts when she least expected it. She would wake up in the middle of the night, her heart racing, convinced that she could hear footsteps outside her window. It took a long time for Mary to feel safe again, but the experience taught her something important. It taught her to be brave, to trust her instincts, and to trust her family. No matter what happened, they would always protect each other, and that, in the end, was what mattered most. Story 2: The Motel's Secret. John had always considered himself a seasoned traveler. Over the years, his job had taken him to countless cities, small towns, and remote locations. He had slept in more motels than he could count, from the luxury chains to the small, family-run places that seemed to exist only on the fringes of society. But there was one motel in particular that he had always found comforting, a small, quaint establishment nestled in a quiet town, far from the hustle and bustle of the big cities. It was the kind of place that felt frozen in time, with its wooden floors, faded wallpaper, and the faint scent of lavender lingering in the air. John had fond memories of this motel. His aunt and uncle had owned it when he was a child, and he had spent many summers there, running through the halls, playing in the courtyard, and listening to the soothing sound of the fountain as he fell asleep at night. Though his aunt and uncle had sold the place years ago, it still retained much of its old charm. Whenever John found himself passing through that town, he would make it a point to stay there, enjoying the nostalgia that came with it. But this time, something felt different. It was late afternoon when John arrived at the motel. The sun was beginning to set, casting long shadows across the courtyard. The motel was just as he remembered it, quaint and welcoming, with its familiar creaky wooden floors and the same faded wallpaper that had been there for decades. He checked in at the front desk, where a young woman with a kind smile handed him the key to his usual room on the second floor. The room was cozy, with a large bed covered in a patchwork quilt, a wooden dresser, and a small writing desk by the window. The window overlooked the courtyard, where the old fountain still bubbled quietly, its gentle sound a constant companion. John unpacked his bags, enjoying the sense of calm that the place always brought him. After a long day of driving, he was looking forward to a good night's sleep. As night fell, John found himself feeling unusually restless. He had always liked to leave the window slightly open at night, letting in the cool breeze and the soothing sounds of the fountain. But tonight, the breeze felt different, colder, almost biting, and the sounds outside seemed sharper, more pronounced. He shook off the uneasy feeling, telling himself it was just fatigue from the long drive. It wasn't long before John drifted off to sleep, the bed's warmth and the soft hum of the fountain lulling him into a deep slumber. But his peace was short-lived. Around midnight, he was abruptly awakened by a strange sound, faint at first, but growing louder with each passing moment. It was the sound of furniture being dragged across the floor above him, slow and deliberate, as if someone was rearranging the room in the dead of night. John sat up in bed, listening intently. The sound was unmistakable, a steady scraping noise that seemed to echo through the ceiling. He glanced at the clock on the nightstand. 12:15 a.m. Who could be moving furniture at this hour? The motel had always been quiet at night, with few guests and even fewer disturbances. John had stayed in the room beneath his before and had never heard a sound. Annoyed and a little curious, John tried to ignore the noise, pulling the pillow over his head in an attempt to block it out. But the sound persisted, relentless in its rhythm. After what felt like hours, the noise finally stopped, and John, exhausted, fell back into a restless sleep. The next morning, John couldn't shake the memory of the noise. As he made his way to the front desk to check out, he casually mentioned it to the receptionist, the same young woman who had checked him in the day before. "Did someone stay in the room above mine last night?" he asked, trying to sound nonchalant. The receptionist frowned and checked her records. "No, sir," she replied after a moment. "That room has been empty for weeks." John blinked in surprise. "Empty? Are you sure?" "I heard someone moving furniture up there in the middle of the night." The receptionist shook her head, looking puzzled. "I'm positive. The room hasn't been occupied in a while. Maybe the sound came from somewhere else." John forced a smile and nodded, though the explanation didn't sit right with him. He thanked the receptionist and left the motel, but the memory of the noise lingered, nagging at the back of his mind. That night, John found himself back at the motel. He had planned to drive further, but a sudden storm had rolled in, making the roads treacherous. Reluctantly, he decided to stay another night. This time, he requested a different room, far from the one he had stayed in the night before. The new room was on the opposite side of the motel, overlooking the garden instead of the courtyard. It was just as cozy, with a similar quilt-covered bed and a small writing desk by the window. John settled in, hoping for a peaceful night's sleep. But as midnight approached, the unease he had felt the night before returned. He tried to ignore it, telling himself it was just his imagination playing tricks on him. He had almost convinced himself when he heard it again, the same dragging sound, slow and deliberate, but this time coming from the room directly above his new one. John's heart pounded in his chest as he lay there, listening. The noise was unmistakable, the same scraping sound that had kept him awake the night before. But how could it be? The room above his old one was empty, and now it seemed that the room above his new one was empty too. Was someone playing a trick on him? Or was something more sinister at play? Unable to take it any longer, John grabbed his phone and called the front desk. The receptionist sounded concerned when he explained what was happening and promised to send the night guard up immediately. Within minutes, there was a knock on John's door. The night guard, an older man with a calm demeanor, stood in the hallway, a flashlight in hand. "I'll check it out," he said, his voice steady. "You stay here." John watched as the guard made his way upstairs, his footsteps barely audible on the creaky wooden stairs. John waited in his room, the minutes stretching out interminably as he strained to hear anything from above. The noise had stopped as soon as the guard arrived, leaving an oppressive silence in its wake. Finally, the guard returned, his expression unreadable. "There's no one up there," he said simply. "The room is empty, just like the receptionist said. The furniture is in place, and there's no sign of anyone having been there." John's unease deepened. "But I heard it," he insisted. "It was the same noise as last night." "I know I wasn't imagining it," the guard nodded slowly. "I believe you," he said, "but there's nothing up there now. I'll keep an eye on things for the rest of the night, just to be safe." John thanked him and tried to settle back into bed, but sleep was elusive. Every little noise made him jump, and he kept imagining the furniture above him moving on its own, driven by some unseen force. His mind raced with possibilities. Was it a prank? A ghost? Or something even worse? As the hours dragged on, John's thoughts became darker, more paranoid. He began to wonder if he was losing his mind. How could the same thing happen in two different rooms, both supposedly empty? Was the motel hiding something? Or was it something about him that was drawing the strange occurrences? Eventually, exhaustion took over, and John drifted into a fitful sleep. But his dreams were plagued by images of the motel, its dark, empty rooms, the creaking floors, and the relentless sound of furniture being dragged across the floor. In his dreams, the sound grew louder and louder until it drowned out everything else, filling his mind with a cacophony of scraping and grinding. When he woke the next morning, the sun was shining brightly, and the motel seemed peaceful once again. But the memory of the night before clung to him like a shadow. He packed his bags quickly, eager to leave, but as he drove away, he couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching him, something he couldn't see. As the miles stretched out between him and the motel, John tried to put the experience behind him. But the memory lingered, creeping into his thoughts at odd moments. He found himself thinking about the motel at night, wondering what had caused the strange noises. He even considered going back, just to see if it would happen again, but the thought filled him with dread. Over the following weeks, John's thoughts were consumed by the motel. He began researching its history, looking for any clue that might explain what had happened. He scoured old newspapers, searching for stories of hauntings or tragedies, but found nothing. The motel had always been a quiet, unremarkable place, with no dark past or hidden secrets. But as John delved deeper, he began to notice something strange. Every time he mentioned the motel to someone in the town, they would grow quiet, their expressions unreadable. They would give him vague answers, changing the subject quickly, as if they didn't want to talk about it. It was as if the entire town was keeping a secret, one that they were afraid to share. One evening, unable to resist the pull any longer, John decided to return to the motel. He had to know what was going on, even if it meant confronting whatever had been causing the disturbances. He packed a small bag, checked out of his current motel, and drove back to the quiet town where the mysterious events had begun. The sun was setting by the time John arrived at the motel. The familiar building stood before him, just as it always had, but now it seemed different, darker, more foreboding. The air was still, and the usual sounds of the town seemed muted, as if the world was holding its breath. John checked in at the front desk, noting the way the receptionist avoided his gaze as she handed him the key. He made his way to his usual room, the one overlooking the courtyard, and unpacked his bag, trying to ignore the growing sense of dread that gnawed at his insides. That night, as the clock struck midnight, John braced himself for the sound he knew was coming. And right on cue, it began, the slow, deliberate scraping of furniture being dragged across the floor above him. But this time, there was something different about it. The sound was louder, more insistent, as if whatever was causing it was trying to get his attention. John's heart pounded in his chest as he grabbed a flashlight and headed for the stairs. He had to know what was going on, even if it meant confronting the unknown. As he climbed the creaky steps, the noise grew louder, echoing through the empty halls. He reached the door to the room above his and hesitated. The sound was deafening now, as if the entire room was being torn apart. With trembling hands, he reached for the doorknob and turned it slowly, pushing the door open. The room was empty. But it wasn't just empty, it was pristine. The furniture was in perfect order, untouched, with no sign of disturbance. The bed was neatly made, the dresser polished, the curtains drawn. There was no dust, no cobwebs, nothing to indicate that the room had been unoccupied for weeks. John stood in the doorway, his mind reeling. How could this be? He had heard the noise with his own ears, felt it vibrating through the floor. But now, standing in the empty room, it was as if nothing had ever happened. Suddenly, the door slammed shut behind him, trapping him inside. John's heart leapt into his throat as he whirled around, only to find himself staring into the darkness. The room had changed, gone with the neat furnishings and tidy space. In their place were shadows, deep and suffocating, closing in on him from all sides. And then he saw it, a figure standing in the corner, shrouded in darkness. It was tall and thin, its form barely visible in the dim light. But there was something wrong with it, something unnatural. The figure's limbs were twisted, its posture grotesque, as if it didn't belong in this world. John tried to move, but his feet were rooted to the spot. The figure began to move toward him, its steps slow and deliberate, echoing the sound of the furniture being dragged across the floor. As it approached, John felt a wave of cold wash over him, chilling him to the bone. The figure stopped just inches from John, its face hidden in the shadows. For a moment, there was nothing but silence, a heavy, oppressive silence that pressed down on John like a weight. And then the figure spoke, its voice a low, guttural whisper, "You shouldn't have come back." John's heart pounded in his chest as the figure reached out, its hand cold and clammy as it touched his shoulder. The room seemed to spin around him, the darkness closing in, suffocating him, until he could no longer breathe. And then, just as suddenly as it had begun, it was over. The door to the room flew open, and John stumbled out into the hallway, gasping for air. The figure was gone, the room behind him silent and still. He didn't look back as he fled down the stairs, his heart racing, his mind numb with fear. John didn't stop running until he was in his car, the engine roaring to life as he sped away from the motel, his hands shaking on the wheel. He drove through the night, the darkness of the road ahead barely registering in his mind. He never returned to that motel again. But the memory of that night, the sound of the furniture moving on its own, the figure in the darkness, those things would stay with him forever. No matter how far he drove, no matter how many miles he put between himself and that quiet town, he could never escape the feeling that something had followed him, something that would never let him go. Story 3. The Whispering Forest. Tommy had always loved the forest that surrounded his family's house. It was a vast, dense woodland that stretched out for miles, a place where the trees whispered secrets to the wind and the ground was carpeted with a thick layer of leaves and moss. The forest had been his playground for as long as he could remember. He had spent countless hours exploring its depths, climbing its trees, and imagining all sorts of adventures among the shadows. But one night, the forest's whispers turned into something far more sinister, and Tommy's love for the woods was forever changed. It was a stormy night when it happened. The rain pounded against the windows, and the wind howled through the trees like a restless spirit. Lightning flashed across the sky, casting eerie shadows on the walls of Tommy's house. He was home alone that night. His mother and siblings had gone to the hospital to visit his father, who had been ill for several weeks. Tommy had insisted on staying behind, wanting to prove that he was old enough to handle being alone. But as the storm raged outside, the house felt too big, too empty. The ticking of the clock on the wall seemed unnaturally loud, and every creak of the old wooden floors sent shivers down his spine. Tommy tried to distract himself by watching TV, but he couldn't focus on the screen. His eyes kept drifting to the windows, where the wind-swept trees seemed to come alive in the flashes of lightning. And then he heard a voice, soft and clear, calling his name. Tommy. Tommy froze, his heart skipping a beat. He quickly muted the TV, straining to listen. For a moment, there was only the sound of the storm outside, the rain beating against the roof, and the wind rattling the windows. But then the voice came again, A little louder this time, double quotes, Tommy double quotes, it was coming from upstairs. Tommy's heart pounded in his chest as he stood up, glancing nervously toward the staircase. He was supposed to be alone in the house. His mother and siblings wouldn't be back for hours. So who could be calling his name? Gathering his courage, Tommy crept toward the stairs, each step slow and deliberate. The old wooden steps creaked under his weight, and he winced at the sound, as if afraid it would alert whoever or whatever was upstairs. The voice had been so clear, so real, that it couldn't have been his imagination. As he reached the top of the stairs, Tommy hesitated. The hallway was dark, the only light coming from the faint glow of a nightlight at the far end. The voice had come from his parents' room, the door slightly ajar, allowing a sliver of light to spill out into the hallway. The air felt thick, heavy with tension, as if the house itself was holding its breath. "Tommy," the voice called again, and Tommy shivered. It was closer now, coming from just behind the door. Taking a deep breath, he reached out and pushed the door open. The room was empty. Tommy stepped inside, his heart still racing. The room was just as he had left it earlier in the day, his parents' bed neatly made, the curtains drawn, the dresser in its usual place. There was no sign of anyone. The voice had been so clear, so close, but now it was gone, leaving behind only an unsettling silence. Tommy's eyes darted around the room, searching for anything out of place. He checked the closet, peeking behind the hanging clothes, but there was nothing there. He even looked under the bed, his breath hitching as he lowered himself to the floor. But the space was empty, save for a few forgotten shoes and a layer of dust. Feeling a chill run down his spine, Tommy decided to leave the room. As he turned to go, something caught his eye, a shadow moving outside the window. Tommy's breath caught in his throat as he slowly approached the window. The storm made it difficult to see clearly, the rain pouring down in sheets and the wind whipping the trees into a frenzy. But in the brief flash of lightning, he saw it standing at the edge of the forest, just beyond the backyard fence, was a figure. It was too dark to make out any details, but Tommy knew someone was there. The figure stood still, unmoving, its gaze fixed on the house. Another flash of lightning lit up the sky, and Tommy felt his stomach drop. The figure was gone. Panic set in as Tommy backed away from the window. He raced downstairs, his heart hammering in his chest, and quickly locked all the doors. He grabbed the phone to call his mother, but there was no signal. The storm must have knocked out the service. He was trapped alone in the house, with the storm raging outside and a stranger lurking in the shadows. Tommy decided to stay in the living room, where he could keep an eye on both the front and back doors. He turned off the lights, hoping it would make it harder for anyone outside to see in, and sat on the couch, clutching a flashlight. The minutes dragged on, each one feeling like an eternity. Every creak, every gust of wind made him jump, his nerves frayed and his mind racing with fear. Then, just as he was beginning to calm down, Tommy heard a soft tapping sound coming from the back door. His breath caught in his throat as he turned toward the sound. Through the glass of the back door, he saw it again, the figure, standing on the porch, closer this time. The lightning flashed, illuminating the figure's face. It was pale, with dark, hollow eyes that seemed to bore into Tommy's soul. Tommy screamed and fell back, dropping the flashlight. He scrambled to pick it up, but when he shone the beam toward the door, the figure was gone. He could feel his heart pounding in his ears, his body trembling with fear. He didn't know what to do. Every instinct told him to run, but where could he go? The storm outside was relentless, and the stranger could be anywhere. In a desperate bid to stay safe, Tommy decided to hide. He ran to the closet under the stairs, a small, cramped space filled with old coats and shoes. He squeezed inside, pulling the door shut behind him, and tried to calm his breathing. He could hear the rain pounding on the roof, the wind howling like a banshee, and the occasional rumble of thunder. The minutes stretched on, each one more agonizing than the last. Tommy sat in the darkness, his mind playing tricks on him, making him think he heard footsteps outside the closet or whispers in the distance. He was too scared to move, too scared to even breathe. Finally, exhaustion took over, and Tommy drifted into a fitful sleep. He didn't know how long he was out, but he was jolted awake by the sound of voices, familiar voices, calling his name. "Tommy! Tommy, where are you?" Tommy's eyes snapped open, and he blinked in the darkness, disoriented. For a moment, he didn't know where he was. Then he remembered the storm, the figure, the closet. But the voices, those were his mother's and siblings' voices. He slowly opened the closet door and peeked out. The storm had passed, and the house was filled with the soft light of dawn. He could hear the voices again, coming from the living room. Taking a deep breath, he stepped out of the closet and made his way down the hallway. When he reached the living room, he saw his mother, brother, and sister standing there, looking worried and relieved at the same time. His mother rushed over and pulled him into a tight hug, her voice trembling. "Tommy, are you okay? What happened? We've been looking for you everywhere." Tommy nodded, tears welling up in his eyes. "I heard someone calling my name from upstairs," he whispered, his voice shaky. "And I saw someone outside. They were standing right there on the porch." His mother's face grew pale as she glanced toward the back door. "You must have been imagining things, sweetie," she said, trying to sound reassuring. "It was just the storm and being alone in the house. It can play tricks on your mind," but Tommy knew what he had seen, what he had heard. The memory of the figure standing in the rain, those dark, hollow eyes staring at him, was burned into his mind. It wasn't his imagination, it was real. As the days passed, Tommy tried to push the experience out of his mind, but he couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching him. He avoided the forest, staying close to the house, and he never went outside after dark. The once comforting whispers of the trees now filled him with dread. His mother tried to comfort him, telling him it was all just a bad dream, but Tommy knew better. The figure in the rain, the voice calling his name, it was all too real. And he couldn't help but wonder if the forest had something to do with it. The trees had always seemed alive to him, whispering secrets that he could never quite understand. But now, those whispers felt malevolent, as if the forest itself was trying to lure him back. One evening, as the sun began to set, Tommy found himself standing at the edge of the forest, staring into its dark depths. The wind rustled the leaves, and the shadows of the trees seemed to stretch out toward him, beckoning him to step inside. He could feel the pull, a strange compulsion to walk into the woods, to find out what was waiting for him there. But Tommy resisted. He knew that whatever was in the forest wasn't something he wanted to face. He turned and ran back to the house, slamming the door behind him, trying to block out the whispers that seemed to follow him all the way home. Years later, Tommy would still think about that night. The memory of the storm, the voice, and the figure in the rain haunted him, creeping into his thoughts when he least expected it. He never returned to the forest, never let himself get too close. The woods, once a place of adventure and wonder, had become a place of fear, hiding secrets that he never wanted to uncover. And though he tried to move on, to forget what had happened, Tommy knew deep down that the forest was still watching him, waiting for the day when he would finally give into its whispers. Hey there, it's Mr. Night Horror. If you enjoyed this eerie journey and want to dive deeper into the shadows with us, don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell. Thanks for watching, and I'll be back with more spine-chilling tales tomorrow. Stay haunted.